Serious discussions about space exploration, the exploitation of resources that are found through such exploration, and the possibility of extraterrestrial colonization must include careful consideration of the extent of our moral responsibility in doing such things. One challenge in this connection is that thinking in terms of moral responsibility, our track record of exploring this planet, exploiting its resources and creating colonies is, in a word, bad. And that is the case even though much that we value emerged from even the members of that type. However, if there's no good reason to believe that that track record can be ignored or discounted, we ought to carefully consider whether and how we can avoid creating a similar record. One might object to the claim that our track record is bad, but such an objection would be about as credible as John C. Calhoun's claim on the floor of the United States Senate that slavery is a positive good. As a matter of fact, Calhoun made that claim twice in the same venue, on February 6, 1837 and January 10, 1838. However, repetition did not change the fact that his claim was false. That said, it should be acknowledged that beliefs like Calhoun's were widespread in the slaveholding states. One reason for that is that such beliefs were a source of comfort for God-fearing people who believed that one paid a high price for wrongdoing. Scripture tells us that the wages of sin are death. That sin leads to spiritual death and separation from God. It was, then, important for those who participated in and profited from the institution of slavery that it was justified. This sort of thing was not unprecedented. It was a prominent concurrent feature of the arrival of Europeans in the Americas. It's noteworthy that, like Spanish colonialism in the Americas, which included the enslavement of native people, what Calhoun referred to as the South's peculiar institution, was both defended and criticized by reference to natural law. That is, on the basis of principles that, according to Thomas Aquinas, every reasonable person is capable of recognizing. In the Summa Theologica, he put the point this way, quote, whatever the practical reason naturally apprehends as man's good or evil belongs to the precepts of natural law as something to be done or avoided. John Locke and Marcus Tullius Cicero spoke of the natural law in much the same way. And so it emerges that the need for moral consideration with respect to exploration, profitable utilization of resources, and colonization was recognized by agents responsible for what I call our bad track record. That prompts a question. What went wrong? One response would be that the moral theory that those agents relied on was not up to the task. That natural law theory does not withstand critical scrutiny. One problem is the metaphysical character of the theory in the absence of the evidence. Another problem is its psychological dimension and the attendant subjectivity. Danish legal philosopher Alf Ross speaks bluntly about the upshot when he writes, quote, like a harlot, natural law is at the disposal of everyone. The ideology does not exist that cannot be defended by an appeal to the law of nature. And indeed, how could it be otherwise? Since the ultimate basis of every natural right lies in the private direct insight, evident contemplation, and intuition. Now there are, of course, other significant justificatory frameworks. And as I mentioned earlier, a significant feature of our track record is that much that we value emerged from activities that created it. What bearing does this have on moral judgments? Answers to that question will vary with the moral framework that's being employed. For instance, those who embrace a deontological framework, such as that championed by Immanuel Kant, would insist that the answer to the question about the significance of overvaluing the results of exploration or colonization is that, morally speaking, it matters not at all. The value of an action's consequences is beside the point in properly made moral judgments. It is completely irrelevant. From this perspective, it may well be the case that good consequences coincide with right action, and bad consequences with wrong action. But no action is morally right because it has good consequences, and no action is wrong because it has bad consequences. If they overlap, that can only be coincidence. So, for example, adducing the good consequences of colonialism, such as the expansion of territory under empire's control, or the considerable wealth generated when workers are enslaved rather than employed, that would have no justificatory force. Even if those results are truly valued, that makes no difference. From a consequentialist perspective, however, the value of consequences is the basis of properly made moral judgments. For example, if the consequences of Spanish colonialism, which included the enslavement of native peoples, were better than the consequences of any other realistic alternative, then, even if it leaves us with a bad taste in our mouths, we should say that Spanish colonialism was morally acceptable. That is right. According to a standard criticism of consequentialist thinking, a bad taste in our mouths is a signal that something is amiss. Put another way, it constitutes a showing that consequentialism fails in the sense that it marks something as right that isn't. What can a consequentialist say in response to such a criticism? She may agree that something is amiss, and so launch an investigation into facts on the ground that were considered in making the judgment that Spanish colonialism had better consequences than any reasonable alternative. Perhaps some relevant consequences were overlooked, neglected, or evaluated wrongly, or the value calculations were based on a misunderstanding or factual error. In their entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Colonialism, Margaret Cohn and Kavita Reedy report that the Spanish, quote, concluded that the habits of the Native Americans, from nakedness to unwillingness to labor to alleged cannibalism, clearly demonstrated their inability to recognize natural law. And that established that there was a fundamental and morally decisive difference between them and the Native Americans, which they understood as providing them with a moral license to enslave them. Calhoun believed essentially the same thing, and he attributed it in arguing that slavery was, he articulated it in arguing that slavery is a positive good. These are his words. I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slave-owning states between the two is, instead of an evil, good, a positive. In mounting her defense of consequentialist thinking, our consequentialist would surely point to, among other things, the factual error made by the enslavers in both cases, namely that those they enslaved were fundamentally different from them, and in that way justified their enslavement. Consequentialist thinking and ethics is defensible, and more important, it is clearly a better fit with the empiricism of modern science than deontology in its most familiar form. That's the deontology propounded by Immanuel Kant. Moreover, that facts on the ground are morally germane, if not decisive in themselves, is intuitive, reasonable, and baked into the role and responsibilities of professional practice. Responsibility has more than one sense. As it happens, responsibility in the sense of moral culpability, legal susceptibility to punishment, or legal accountability in the form of compensation to one's victim may be the sense that's most familiar. The adjectives moral and legal specify the norms and terms of which the judgment of responsibility takes place. Whether the applicable norms are moral or legal, the basic idea is that it is the accountability of comeuppance. This is what H.L.A. Hart, who was the Oxford Chair of Jurisprudence, calls the liability sense of responsibility. One of its key features is that it directs attention to the past, to what has been done. But again, the term responsibility has more than one sense. Hart identifies four: role responsibility, causal responsibility, liability responsibility, capacity responsibility. We are all quite familiar with two of those, namely liability responsibility and causal responsibility, as well as the connection between them. We only rarely hold someone responsible for a state of affairs in that sense if it is not the case that the individual is linked causally to the state of affairs. In short, a causal connection is a necessary condition of liability. The relationship between liability and capacity is the same. Capacity, mental capacity for instance, is a necessary condition of liability. Capacity is also a necessary condition of obligation, in the sense that ought implies can. And that explains the link between talk of responsibility in a liability sense and obligation. These ideas are woven together tightly. Role responsibility differs from the other senses that Hart identifies in two ways. First, its connection to culpability is much weaker. It's not that there's no connection to blameworthiness. One can be blamed for failing to fulfill role responsibilities, most often perhaps because such a failure is the beginning of a causal sequence that has unwelcome consequences. Second, and this is the most salient feature of role responsibility, is that it looks to the future rather than the past. It asks a question like this: who is supposed to clean up this mess, rather than who created this mess? Thinking in terms of role responsibility rather than the more familiar notions of causal and liability responsibility, our approach is rectificatory rather than culpatory. There are two types of rectificatory responsibility. Faced with unintended consequences that are unwelcome, for example, a mess, and assuming our concern is not the proper ascription of blame, there are at least two sorts of forward-looking rectificatory responsibility. One is directly attached to the agent and might be called personal. The other is directly attached to the capacity in which one is an agent, or parsimoniously, one's role as a lawyer, physician, or researcher, for example. We can cash out that idea this way. You intentionally created this mess. It's yours. You own it. That's why cleaning it up is your responsibility. What we've got here is straightforward and not far removed from the usual cause-liability line. In this case, one's rectificatory responsibility, much like compensatory responsibility, is grounded in a causal connection to an unwelcome state of affairs. The role variety of rectificatory responsibility does not involve a causal connection. If the role agent owns the mess, that is, if there is a sense in which it is hers, it isn't because she created it. Thinking in these terms is most appropriate when the unwelcome state of affairs is rooted in practice, for example, professional practice, rather than being the upshot of an action by a layperson, an everyman. Here's the basic idea. Even though you did not create the mess, you have to deal with it. It's your responsibility. Failure to act jeopardizes the enterprise that we're involved in, say, for instance, the profession. This sort of rectificatory responsibility is entailed by one's role in an undertaking and commitment to its success. It is inherently, indeed profoundly practical. Given that the undertaking is not morally repugnant, as for instance running a concentration camp or human trafficking is, the legitimate expectations associated with success of the enterprise also has some moral force, which is why responsibility language is apt. Occupying the role is a necessary and sufficient condition of responsibility in this sense. Illustrations of this are ready to hand. Think of actors dealing with dropped lines or a missed cue, for example, or baseball players recovering from an error in the infield, or an ensemble of musicians in mid-jam coping with the failure of their lead guitarist's wireless connection to the amplifier. Three things are worth noting here. First, in each of these cases, what is done in dealing with the mess may be done well, very well, or badly. Second, it's not supererogatory. Rather, it is expected. And third, this expectation is the upshot of a sense of shared commitment and reciprocal reliance. Researchers have role responsibilities in this sense. Facing a mess not of their making, for instance, the high incidence of research misconduct, they have a forward-looking rectificatory responsibility to, as it were, clean up the mess. I believe that such rectificatory role responsibility is a posit in the case of space exploration as well, not least because some shamelessly hubristic and wealthy actors who have entered this space will inevitably make a mess of it.